Something is very, very wrong with the PS5 Pro, at least in certain games, and it seems to be the much touted AI upscaling, PSSR. This is supposed to be like the console equivalent to DLSS and solve all of our FSR upscaling woes. But look at this. This looks very, very bad. You can see all of the weird blotchiness, especially over here in these puddles. Now, this isn't my captured footage. I don't actually have a PS5 Pro, but this is getting reported widely all over the internet. This is from a Reddit post that was picked up by where I saw it, which is at The Gamer, where all my sources will be linked in the video description today. This is an article saying PS5 Pro owners are claiming certain games look worse on the enhanced console. So I want to talk about this because while my channel's primarily focused on PC, PC users, a lot of people are interested in AI upscaling competitors to DLSS, especially that might run on AMD hardware. Well, consoles like the PS5 Pro are running AMD hardware, and some people are at least curious whether PSSR is giving us kind of a first look at what an AI-based FSR4 upscaling might look like. Now, I want to be clear that there is actually no indication that PSSR and FSR4 will be the same thing. It's very possible that Sony has developed its own training model to run on AMD hardware, because the hardware, again, is very much AMD hardware. But AMD could be doing their own AI training for their own FSR4 model. But to be clear, AMD is planning for FSR4 to be AI-based. As I have reported on in previous videos, this is a September interview with Tom's Hardware from AMD's vice president of their gaming division, Jack Huynh, who has specifically said that they have been working for 9 to 12 months as of the time of September, indicating they were probably working on it at least since the beginning of 2024 and possibly back into the end of 2023 on an AI-based FSR solution. But again, there is no indication one way or the other whether this would be the same thing as PSSR, whether there's any shared research there. But anyway, I do want to be clear about that. So let's, though, dive into what's going on with PSSR and my thoughts on that. So I've shown the Silent Hill 2 footage. If it was just one game, you'd be like, okay, that's just a bad implementation by that one game. But Digital Foundry has been doing a lot of coverage of the PS5 Pro updates. And if we take a look at Jedi Survivor, for example, we see a lot of the same issues that were going on with Silent Hill 2. Now, in the still screenshot, you're not seeing it, but watch as I play it. Watch for that weird flickering on everything, right? Look, they'll zoom in here. Do you see how everything is just kind of shimmering weirdly? This obviously does not look right. And when they do side-by-side comparisons against the game when it was running on base consoles, I think they have some side-by-sides here where you don't see quite the same issues going on. You'll see that it's definitely not having those same types of weird flickery issues in the original PS5 performance mode, whereas if you look at the foliage in the PSSR version, we are getting these issues. So again, there's clearly something different here. Now, the original PS5 version seemed to be upscaling using FSR, the non-AI based, original like FSR2, some version of FSR2 upscaler here. And again, it's not just Jedi Survivor and Silent Hill 2. We're also seeing similar issues happening in Alan Wake 2. Again, Digital Foundry has covered the PS5 Pro quality mode side by side against the PS5 quality mode. The PS5 version was using, I believe, an FSR-based upscaling technique, and the PS5 Pro has now switched over to PSSR. But as I play the footage, watch out for the weird, splotchy, shimmery, temporally unstable image, right? Can you see it now kind of flickering in the background? Again, all sources will be linked in the video description because I understand that me capturing an already degraded, source from YouTube, the more layers of capture and YouTube upload we give, the less easy to see all of this is. So again, do look at these original sources in the video description. But anyway, so we've established there absolutely is a problem, although not every game looks terrible. If you look at something like Final Fantasy VII, for example, we can see that the original PS5 version looks significantly blurrier than the PSSR-based upscaler that we're seeing here. Not that the PSSR upscale is perfect, but it certainly looks a lot better than the original. Now, one thing to mention here is in the original on this, the upscaling technique isn't even an FSR2 based upscaler. I believe it's more like a spatial upscaler along the lines of FSR1, possibly with some TAA in there. The point is, it's a pretty low quality upscale on the original base version of the game. So maybe not as hard to improve on that, but you're also seeing less of those weird flickering issues. One thing that the games that have issues all seem to have in common is ray tracing. So it's possible that there's some issues with the denoising of the ray tracing not working properly with PSSR. But another big possibility is that these are early versions of PSSR that have been improved on, but the latest version might not have made it into every game. Now, what evidence do I have for that? Well, first of all, there's just the common sense evidence. AI-based models are constantly trained and improved and outputting new updates. And then those updates need to get integrated into games. But which version of the model did game developers have in hand when they started working on their PS5 Pro upgrade? And that could be the version that gets in there. And then when you update to a new model, they might feel like, well, now we'd have to do more quality assurance and all of that to make sure it works. Anyway, so the point is they might have implemented an older model in some games rather than other games. So that's the common sense approach to this. As just kind of a side note sort of evidence of this, like you can find videos comparing the latest version of DLSS all the time. Actually, MX Benchmark PC is a great source for this on YouTube. Again, will be linked in the video description, but here you can see a recent video comparing DLSS 3.8.10 versus 3.7.20 versus a native TAA. And really, this isn't the point of today's video. It's just to show that DLSS is constantly being updated. You might have just heard about DLSS 1, 2, and 3, and maybe when they got ray reconstruction. But actually, the version of DLSS that you get in games is often very, very different from game to game, and it's based on which version the developers chose to implement. Now, the developers don't often update the version of DLSS. However, on the PC side of things, you can drag a upgraded version of the DLSS DLL file into games that had an older version, and you can update it. Or you can even downgrade if you feel like one of the newer models didn't play as nicely as one of the older models in games. And there's a whole PC community around doing this, and there's tools around doing this. Again, not really the point of today's video, but it is absolutely the case that these AI-trained upscaling models are constantly being updated, and game developers are not constantly updating their games to include the latest model. It seems to be that that's very likely what's happening with these early versions of PSSR having these types of issues. And specifically, I do have one more piece of evidence, but I will say that I can't verify that this source is accurate. So if you look at the Reset Era forums discussing these exact issues, the poor quality of PSSR implementations in a number of games, we do have a reply buried in this thread from Koralski, who claims to be a PlayStation game dev who is under NDA, so cannot give full details about what's going on, but definitely seems to be leaning into this older version of PSSR being the issue. So if we read the full quote here, they're talking about Jedi Survivor specifically, so we're looking at these issues specifically where it's kind of more shimmery than it should be on the PSSR side of the screen. So we're talking about those issues in this particular comment. So he's saying, as this is a UE4 game, it's using SDK 9, specifically talking about SDKs for PlayStation implementation. And he says that this also means earlier PSSR implementation, maybe even the initial one. For up-to-date version of PSSR, you need to use later SDKs, specifically saying 10 and up. He also goes on to say, I am pretty sure that UE 5.5 titles using PSSR will look much better, even at lower internal resolution. So again, to kind of summarize what we're hearing so far from the game developer, he's saying, okay, that absolutely there are different SDK versions that games are using when developing for PlayStation 5, and that earlier versions like SDK 9, which you might be using on an UE4 game, and there's a lot of PlayStation 5 games that are running on UE4, are potentially kind of locked to an early, possibly even the initial PSSR implementation. That's definitely a problem. And so the thing is, how much effort are game developers going to put into implementing their PS5 Pro upgrade, right? Because if they would need to change the whole like SDK model, like if they're on an older version of UE4, how much work is this going to be, right? They didn't go into specifics on that, and I'm not a game dev with inside knowledge on this, but I'm wondering again if that's a big part of this issue. He also says he can't give specific details because of NDAs, like, for example, how many different PSSR iterations are already available. Again, remember comparing to something like DLSS we might be more familiar with, where DLSS is all the way up to version 3.8.10 now, right? There could be potentially a lot of updated models. But again, he's saying he can't comment on actually how many there are, even if he knows, or what kind of improvements each of those model updates present. But he does say that you can expect image quality improvements in the second and third batch of PS5 Pro supported games using PSSR. So in other words, these games that are just updating older games that were potentially on older engines that were using SDK 9 or earlier, it's possible that they're locked into a kind of a crappy version of PSSR. And unless the game devs wanted to do potentially a lot more work, I, again, don't know the work involved going from SDK 9 to 10, right? They could be launched into that. But if you get into newer games that would have been developed using SDKs 10 and up, then potentially their PSSR updates for their PS5 Pro update could potentially look a lot better. Again, he follows up with, for a game I'm working on, speaking of, Kowalski here, not me, PSSR, one of the later versions, but not the up-to-date one, is giving much better results in comparison to TSR and FSR. So again, TSR is Unreal Engine's built-in upscaling solution, and FSR, of course, AMD's solution. So I'm expecting, this game dev saying it, that in the next 6 to 12 months, PSSR to be in a much better state in comparison to the initial versions used in the first batch of Pro-supported titles. It already is. Okay, so what are my thoughts on this whole situation, to kind of wrap it all up? Well, okay, my main issue is if a game literally looks as bad as what we are seeing here, where it's incredibly flickery in motion when we're seeing this is just broken. It looks worse than the original. I personally would believe that it would be better to just not even do an enhanced version of the game if the enhanced version is actually just visually worse. Or maybe better, if you're using an old enough model of PSSR that it's actually worse than FSR, just use FSR still and take advantage of the PlayStation 5 Pro's enhanced GPU power, the extra horsepower, to just render the game at a better internal rendering resolution so that FSR has an easier job upscaling it because you're starting from a higher base resolution. Because really the main issues with FSR is that when you're coming from a really low internal rendering resolution, it can really struggle, especially in motion. But the higher your base resolution is before the upscale is applied, the better results you get. So it might be better to just take advantage of that from the increased horsepower rather than taking advantage of an upscaler that actually looks worse. Now, and again, I think game devs should seriously think about that. Now, what do I think of this long-term and as it applies to FSR 4? So again, there's no indication that PSSR and FSR 4 are the same thing. But they are going to be struggling with the same types of issues, which is that, okay, if we got to the AI training late compared to DLSS, which has been doing this for many, many years, DLSS has had many years to refine its model over time. So I think AMD is in a bit of a difficult spot here because, learning from what we're seeing with PSSR, if you get an AI-based model, that doesn't automatically mean it's better than a non-AI-based model. in all situations, especially if the model hasn't had a lot of refinement yet. So I think AMD needs to walk a careful line of they absolutely do need to get an AI-based FSR 4 out there that can better compete with DLSS. Because DLSS is getting to the point where, while it's not always better than native, it's getting very, very close to native. If you see some of this stuff in motion, you can actually see, for example, that it solves a lot of these temporal issues compared to TAA and resolves them better here, even despite running at a lower than native internal rendering resolution. Now, in motion, it can be a little bit harder and can fall apart. But the point is, DLSS is getting really good, and it's a major selling point for NVIDIA GPUs. AMD needs a direct counter to that. FSR in its current models isn't good enough. But if they release too soon, imagine that if the first versions of FSR 4 came out and looked as bad as what we're seeing in some of these kind of shimmery nonsense, where again, these are looking worse than the FSR that we have right now in terms of, shimmering weirdness, right? So if FSR 4 launched in a similar state, I think that would be disastrous. When AMD launches FSR 4, it needs to clearly wipe the floor in image quality with current versions of FSR that are not AI-based. And it really needs to be very, very close to DLSS, where you couldn't really tell the difference in normal gameplay. It needs to compete on that quality. But the problem is it also needs to come soon, because if we get the next generation of GPU launch, which we're expecting in January, and if AMD doesn't have that AI upscaling competitor, it's going to be really hard. It's getting harder and harder to recommend the AMD hardware as DLSS continues to get better. And games like, especially ones developed in Unreal Engine 5, seem to be designed with upscaling in mind, whether we like it or not. That seems to be the case. It becomes a more and more important feature. So I'm just hoping that AMD is able to deliver a high-quality AI upscaler, despite the fact that they've maybe got late to the AI training party. I'm hoping they're able to deliver it, and I think it would be better to launch late and of high quality than it would be to launch soon but have a bad initial reaction. That's my gut feeling on the situation. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.